Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar on the economics of soil health systems on Iowa farms. My name is Byron Rath and I serve as the Soil Health Institute's Sustainability Specialist. Soil Health Institute's a 501c3 nonprofit implementing a comprehensive approach to enhance and protect the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. We're very excited for today's webinar, which is the first in a series of 9 state webinars on the economics of soil health systems, presented by the Soil Health Institute with the support of Cargill. This research addresses the most frequent question that we receive from farmers, landowners, and their advisors. What are the economics of adopting soil health practices and systems? A recording of today's webinar and the fact sheet for the 10 farms assessed in Iowa will be sent to all registrants by email and can also be found on the Soil Health Institute's website at soilhealthinstitute.org/economics. During the presentation, please enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to address those in the last 15 minutes of our presentation, and we've also allotted additional time should we need more for discussion and Q&A. So with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Ryan Ciroli, the Global Row Crop Sustainability Director at Cargill, who will offer opening remarks and introduce Dr. John Shanahan and Dr. Archie Flanders. So with that, turn it over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Byron. And thanks to all of you for logging in today to learn a little bit more in this webinar and getting a little deeper onto this awesome work. So on behalf of Cargill, I would just really like to thank a sincere thanks to all of the growers, who so willingly offered to share their insights and their experience. Without them, this study wouldn't have happened and wouldn't have been possible. So many thanks to them. I would also like to thank since the Soil Health Institute for their leadership and their incredible knowledge to help us better understand the economic benefits of adopting soil health management systems. I really believe that this work is it's really a critical area and critical question that we need to better address as we look at scaling up the adoption of soil health principles. I'd like to ask you as attendees to submit your questions for the panel using the chat feature. And as registrants, you'll receive the fact sheet and after the webinar concludes, and then you'll have a link to the webinar recording on Friday. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Shanahan and Dr. Archie Flanders. Dr. John Shanahan is an agronomist and manager of the Economic Assessment of Soil Health Project for the Soil Health Institute. John's career in the agronomy field has spanned both public and private sector roles, including positions at Colorado State University, USDA ARS, and more recently with Corteva. He has focused much of his efforts on developing and promoting the adoption of more sustainable crop production practices, including soil health and nutrient management solutions. Dr. Archie Flanders is an agricultural economist with the Soil Health Institute, and Dr. Flanders will join us for the Q&A after John finishes his remarks. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, John.
Thanks, Ryan. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear?
We can.
Okay, great. And video's on?
Yep, you're good to go.
All right. Well, thanks for that introduction, Ryan, and thanks also to Cargill for providing the support needed to carry out this important project. Archie and I are extremely excited today to share the results of this project involving the economics of soil health systems in Iowa. Today's results are part of an overall project evaluating the profitability of soil health practices on 100 farms in 9 states highlighted in green on the US map that's seen in front of you here. You'll all recognize that that area represents a significant portion of the Corn Belt, where much of the corn and soybean are produced in the US. We also, like Ryan said, want to express our sincere appreciation to all the farmers who shared their experiences for this important effort. We believe this project can go a long ways towards providing more farmers with the information they need when deciding whether to adopt soil health practices. A little bit of background about why we conducted the project, and Byron mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we've known for some time that soil health practices such as no-till and cover cropping can provide significant environmental benefits, including storing soil carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and improving water quality. And we've also known that these soil health practices can also provide benefits to farmers, including reduced erosion, building some drought resilience into their farming operation, increasing nutrient availability, suppressing diseases, and a whole host of other benefits associated with these practices. However, as Byron said, when we talk to farmers, they often tell us that we need to understand the economics of adopting these practices. They're all businessmen and businesswomen, and of course have to make a profit in order to stay in business. So with that background, our objective for this project was to provide farmers with the economic information they need when deciding to adopt these soil health management systems. So our approach in this particular project, specifically related to Iowa, was we interviewed 10 Iowa farmers who had adopted some form of soil health practices for at least 5 years on their operation and obtained their production information through these interview processes. We felt it was important that they have been practicing these soil health practices for at least 5 years, because oftentimes it takes some time before one sees benefits associated with these practices. After conducting the interview and based on the production information we acquired, we then calculated partial budgets to compare benefits and costs before and after the adoption of these soil health practices. And I'll just refer you to our website if you're interested in more of the detail of our partial budget approach. So the map on the left shows you the location of the 10 farmers that we interviewed in this project. And you'll notice that it's a pretty nice, well-distributed location of these farms that represent the diverse climatic and soil conditions present in Iowa. Also, just call your attention to on the table on the right, the average number of acres in corn and soybean production on these operations. They're relatively even, although a little bit heavier towards corn. But what these numbers indicate is that the corn soybean rotation was strict, for the most part, strictly followed on these operations. And also, I'd just like to call your attention to the average size of these operations, significantly above the U.S. average, indicating these soil health practices can be implemented on large scale operations. One of the other questions we asked the farmers is, what percent of the acres in your operation have you adopted no-till, reduced-till, intensive-till, or cover cropping? And so this first set of bars here represents the blue bar there now represents the average of our 10 interviewed farmers. And so for those 10 interviewed farmers, they had adopted no-till on 83% of their acres. And that compares, that's considerably higher than the average number of acres that where no-till is being adopted and currently adopted in Iowa and of course across the U.S. As surveyed by the USDA. So those farmers who did not adopt no-till in Iowa adopted an alternative reduced-till practice. Oftentimes they mentioned strip-till. Sometimes strip-till was used because it helped them to establish better corn stands under the wet and cool soil spring conditions that they often experience in the state. And none of the farmers actually practicing any intensive tillage. So all of our farmers that we talked to in Iowa were practicing some form of either no-till or reduced-till on their operation. Also, then just call your attention to the significant number of acres that cover crops were planted on these operations. 58% of the farmers, or 58% of the acres that these farmers have been they had devoted to cover cropping. And that compares with the figures of the number of 4% and 5% at Iowa and the U.S. Farm level in terms of adoption of soil health practices. So in summary, these farmers were using many of the soil health practices on a significant number of their acres in their operations. So the next slide, then, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time. This is the meat of our presentation. It's the result of our partial budget analysis of all that production information from those 10 farms. So just keep in mind that those numbers that you're seeing here on this table represent averages for those 10 farmers. And so one thing I'll just mention when we talk about partial budgeting, partial budget results are results of changes in net farm income. They're not absolute levels. In other words, they're not going to dive into the farm profitability of these farms. they're numbers that are associated with changes and due to adopting soil health practice. When one farmer goes from either no-till or the adoption of cover cropping, these numbers represent that change. And so what I'll just call your attention to here, there's columns, the table's divided into halves. And so we got the partial budget benefit results for corn. And on the right half of the table is soybeans. The same practice, same partial budget approaches were used for both crops. And then also call your attention to these columns in the table here in terms of benefits and costs. So in the upper half of that table, you'll see reduced expenses associated with the adoption of a soil health practice versus if some soil health practice required additional expenses. Those numbers or those figures are denoted in red. So it's kind of a cost benefit, the color type of analysis that you use in a typical budget analysis. And I'll just now very quickly call your attention to some of the items in this table. For example, we asked farmers questions about what sort of fertilizer, have their fertilizer practices changed when they adopted soil health practices. And for example, in corn, oftentimes farmers would say, well, yeah, we've been able to cut back on fertilizer applications of N, P, and K or lime or some of those sort of fertilizer inputs or amendments. So you can see there that particularly for corn, the reduction, the benefit associated with adopting soil health practices was considerably more than the costs associated with those practices. Especially for corn, we didn't see quite the same difference in reduction in fertilizer costs for soybeans, and much of that is due to the fact that corn typically has higher input costs for fertilizer, and oftentimes farmers would say that they could reduce their nitrogen fertilizer application rate, for example, if they had introduced, for example, a legume into the cover crop mix. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of sense of how those numbers are calculated for fertilizer. Likewise, if a farmer was going to go from a conventional practice to, say, a reduced till or no-till practice, you might expect that there's going to be less machinery operation, and so you'd expect that there would be probably less fuel consumed, a little bit less labor. And again, and that lines up pretty well with the figures in this table here. You'll see that there's a reduction. The reduced expenses are much greater than the additional costs associated with adopting these practices. Similarly, when you look at equipment ownership costs, if you're doing less tillage, one would expect to see less equipment ownership costs. The machines don't wear out as quickly. And so anyway, so you can see similar type of comparisons when you look over on the soybean side of the table. And then when you sum up all the differences, I'll back up here just once. And so the total expense change when you add up all the benefits and costs for corn and soybeans, it amounts to about a $20 reduction in expenses associated with adoption of soil health practices in corn, and it's around $11 per acre in reduced expenses in adopting soil health practices in soybean. We then asked farmers the question: did they see any kind of a yield increase associated with the adoption of their soil health practices? And what I'll start off by saying here is none of these farmers that we talked to indicated they saw a yield reduction, and some of them said that they saw some somewhat significant yield increases. On average, the corn farmers that we talked to in Iowa indicated that they saw about almost 11 bushel increase on average, 11 bushel increase in corn yield associated with adoption of those soil health practices. So when you multiply that times the average price for corn that we used in calculating the revenue change, it amounts to a $45.78 increase in additional revenue. And you can see a similar change with the soybean farmers. They told us on average that they saw about a $2.60 or 2.6 bushel increase in yield, and multiply that times the average price for soybean, and you'll notice there that there's an additional revenue associated with adopting soil health practices. So when you add up all these benefits and costs and additional revenue, the total benefits for corn were $93.66, and the additional costs associated with soil health practices. So when you subtract those two values, why you end up with a number of $63.85 increase in change in net farm income for corn production on average of those 10 farmers. And for the soybean for their soybean production, it was around $37 per acre increase in net farm income. So recognizing that all farms are different, and some farmers have been in some of these practices a little bit longer, so you might expect that they might see a little bit differences in change in net farm income. But you'll notice all 10 of these farmers saw some positive benefit in net farm income, some rather significant increases in net farm income. And that was for corn. And then for soybeans, just similar situation. There was one farmer that saw a slight decline in net farm income, but 9 out of the 10 farmers there, again, like for corn, saw a pretty nice increase in net farm income. So some significant findings from this project. Again, just a summary of what we just stated here. The average farm size was around 2,100 acres. 83% of those planted acres were in no-till, and about 58% of those planted acres were planted to cover crops. Again, I just want to call out your attention to the size of these operations, indicating that these practices of no-till and cover cropping can be implemented on large-scale operations. Soil health practices, implementation of these practices reduced average production costs by around $22 an acre for corn, and just about $12 an acre for soybean. So that's, even if farmers did not see any yield increase, there's still some benefits associated with reductions in input costs. And likewise, these practices, when adopted, increased the average net farm income by these 10 farmers around $64 an acre for corn and around $37 an acre for soybean. So if you look at the current adoption rate of no-till and cover cropping in Iowa, one should be able to conclude that other farmers could potentially increase their net farm income by adopting some of these practices. So that's near the end here. I'll just call your attention. This is a screen capture of the fact sheet that we produced for this Iowa study. And so I'll just mention to you that this fact sheet can be found at our website on soilhealthinstitute.com. And there will also be a recording of this presentation posted there by the end of the week. So again, just want to thank you for joining us in this presentation. And also remind you that a week from today, we'll be hosting a similar presentation on the results from the Nebraska interview. So if you're interested in that, why sign up for that webinar, and we'd look forward to seeing you there. So again, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up then for questions.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you to all who have entered questions into both the Q&A and the chat. Just to start off, I think this is a good place to start. John, what criteria did you use in selecting the farmers and their locations?
Right, so that's a great question. And we were looking for farmers who had been adopting either cover cropping or no-till, cover cropping and or no-till for at least 5 years. And the reason that criteria was selected, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that we wanted to make sure that these farmers had been into the system for some number of years. And so they were at a point in their journey with soil health practices where they started to see and accrue those benefits associated with some of these practices.
Great. We have 2 questions, and there may be others, but look to be similar, around where you accounted for the additional cost of the cover crop, both the planting. So the specific questions, where in the partial budget table do we see the additional cost of the cover crops? And then related, what expense category captures the planting of the
right? So I'll go back to our slide. Can you see the table there now?
Yeah.
So I'm so if you're looking at additional costs here, the cover crop on average now, and not every farmer, keep in mind, not every farmer was using cover crops. Remember, we said 60% or about 58% of the farmers. So this is the average increase in the cover crop seed, say for corn, and then the 585 and then 765 would be the additional. That would be the seed costs associated with the cover crop seed. And then so the planting operation would be incorporated into some of these other things like labor and fuel. So there's an additional cost here over in the cost side of equation. So the planning costs, if there were any, were over there in one of those columns.
Great. Okay. Another person had asked, what percentage of the total farmers in Iowa are represented by the farmers that we interviewed? So I don't know, do you have a handle on how many farmers are in Iowa, John? Or
I'll have to plead ignorance there. I mean, I guess
Lloyd, we might have to, yeah.
I was going to say one comparison we can make maybe is if you want to make a comparison to the average farmer, why the adoption of no-till, I don't have that slide right in front of me, but so national average is 35%. I think it's 35% in Iowa and 37% on a national basis. So if you compare the farmers that we interviewed here compared to the other farmers in the state, well, I guess you would say that these farmers are using a lot more of these practices such as no-till and cover cropping. Then I don't know if that gets an answer to the question or not, Byron. Are you still there, Ryan?
Hear me?
I'd say, did I answer our question, do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, we just have a number of questions, so just moving through.
Okay.
Another question, John. How is the yield change from adopting soil health management systems calculated? Is there a control field without soil health management system practices?
Yeah, that's an outstanding, great question. So our interview questions were basically questions around perception. So there was no, in some cases, I should say there were some farmers who had on-farm trials where they had conducted practices where they had strips of alternating strips of no cover crops and no cover crops. And so they had some pretty definitive numbers on the yield changes. So what we recorded in these interviews was what their perception of what they thought they saw from the benefits associated with these practices. So it's a perception question.
Okay. Move over here to the chat. Over what period of time did the interviewed farmers see an increase in corn and soybean yield? Do we capture that information?
So the average number, I'm just thinking that information in terms of the number of years that these practices have been done, say for the Iowa farmers, it was around 20 years. Many of these growers had been using no-till, and almost across the whole country, folks that had been working with cover crops mentioned 10 years as the amount of time they had been using these practices. So I'm not sure we can answer the question is how quickly do these benefits accrue? Because that's the question I think a lot of us have is when growers start these practices, when can they start to expect to see these benefits? And I'm afraid that this project isn't going to provide a very satisfying answer for that question.
Okay. Here are a couple related from the same registrant or same person. Did we see any differences or did we look at kind of corn on corn rotations? So any differences in the economics on corn rotations? And then second is around manure. How did we value manure additions?
Right. So the corn on thorn thing, I mean, you could see by the acreage distribution that there was a few farmers that were using corn on corn, but we didn't really parse anything out there in terms of benefits associated with those practices. Might have been a couple anecdotal comments that were made, but really nothing very definitive there that we can answer around that question. And then let's see, what the second part of that question was.
Manure. Was there any manure additions, and how did we account for value that addition of manure?
Right. So, I mean, we asked that question: were they supplementing their nutrient program with manure? I mean, one of our approaches there was that that likely would have happened whether they were doing soil health practices or not. So it really never got really entered into the partial budget part of our process. Okay.
Moving over here to the Q&A. David asks if any of the farmers had savings on corn seed. He's heard that farmers say that they need fewer traits in their seed to get cheaper seed. So does that, he said that this does not seem to be reflected in our numbers for corn, but maybe for soybeans.
We did have a couple of farmers mention that it was their impression that they were able to go to non-GMO seed traded products because the cover crops and things like that broke up some weed cycles, helped with the weed competition, and so they were able to. So there is the reduced expense on seed costs. If you look at soybeans, for example, I think Archie may have to correct me here, but that $3 per acre benefit was likely due to a farmer who was using a non-GMO seed product. And also, if you look down in the table here, where there was an increase, a benefit of about 10, this is an average number for here now. So that farmer, those two farmers were able to sell their non-GMO seed for their product for a higher value. So that in fact was included in our partial budget analysis. The question we asked the farmers specifically is, were you using non-GMO products specifically because you had adopted the soil health practice? So we were trying to be clear about what was the practice was using the non-GMO product associated with soil health practice. So that we got to the bottom of that question.
Okay. I think this is a question about practices and systems. This person is asking, what practice did you find was the biggest profit contributor or had the biggest economic impact?
And that, I'm assuming that question is, was it no-till or cover cropping?
Sure.
Yeah, so we kind of took the approach that this was sort of an integrated package, and we may have some opportunity to evaluate that when we conclude all 100 of the interviews, but I don't think we would have enough data here in this particular subsample to answer that question.
Okay, great. And second question, I think, goes maybe forward, maybe a slide or two, John, in which you showed the benefits ranging from dollars per acre benefits. And David is asking if we dug into the understanding as to why the benefits ranged from, you see, here, $16 per acre to $158. How can we get more farmers to having that benefit of $158 an acre?
Yeah, I mean, and oftentimes many of those cases, that was some of the farmers that reported maybe just a little bit higher yield, the yield benefit associated with the practice, or that in that case they were one of those farmers, I think, was using that non-GMO product, and so the revenue that they generated from using that product was significantly greater than the GMO product. So I think that's a combination of where you saw those real the greater increases in net farm income.
About the yield and seeds.
Yeah.
Okay. How was the question? How was the cost benefit calculated for the fertilizer amendment and pesticide use?
Okay. You know what, Archie? I think I'm going to let you answer that question just to make sure we get that one right.
It was collected during the interview process. The way we collected it, the information for each of the crops, we asked them what fertilizers have you reduced due to the soil health management system, and sometimes they have also added one. Same as pesticides. We went, we did it with sort of like a ledger type. We did the conventional. What inputs have you eliminated since you have adopted the soil health management system, and then which have you added? And then we took the numbers you saw were a comparison of what we collected that way.
All right, moving through. What were the cost, or how were the cost share payments from NRCS, such as EQIP or other state provided funds, included in the cost benefit calculations, John?
Right. So those were not included in these calculations.
Okay. So those cost share payments from NRCS state funds were not included in our
no, we did not include those in there. Many of the farmers had started out with using some of those cost share programs, but I think some of those things have kind of a lifetime, and so by the number of years that they had been in these systems, they were no longer participating. Many of them anyway were not participating in those programs anymore.
This should be a quick one, John. Do the 10 farms represented here, or are those all the participants in the SHI Iowa study?
Yes, this is this is a sample of farmers that we talked to. These were the only farmers we talked to in Iowa.
This is another question from Clint Pilcher asking about your, I guess, view. What is the average revenue needed on a dollar per acre basis to encourage more farmers to try soil health management systems?
The average increase in net farm income?
The average revenue needed on a dollar per acre basis might be a difficult one to ask from this.
Archie, do you have any thoughts
project
there?
From the results we have, I think if you look at the difference in additional and reduced expenses and additional expenses for corn, that's about $20, and then for soybeans it's about 10. So this would be for those who don't observe a yield increase. Not every farmer is going to have a yield increase, but after a few years, you can count on some reduced expenses. So I would say from the results we have, we can say about $20 for corn and less than that for soybeans. Because just the reduced expenses generally are going to come. The increased yield may not be realized.
And Byron, just the one caveat to add on that, just so that everybody remembers that these farmers they've seen these benefits after being in the system for 4 or 5 years. So there might be some additional startup costs associated with that, but after 4 or 5 years, to Archie's point, these are the type of reductions in costs associated with corn and soybean production.
Great. All right, we have another about 40 questions to run through. So just for all who are still on the line, this webinar recording will be made available. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up in a more specific email, but we have allotted about another 30 minutes to run through this for those who are able to stay on the line with us. Here's an interesting question, John. Do you have any detailed information on the practices that were included here that we made available, such as how many of these farmers were planting green versus terminating the cover crop before planting? Do you know that for these Iowa farmers?
I haven't summarized that information. I think we probably have it somewhere in the notes. Yeah, but it wouldn't be.
So maybe that's something we can put an asterisk in and maybe follow up with Paul on that.
Right.
Okay. Somebody else asked, did the farmers indicate any adjustments that they made over time to reduce costs of these soil health practices or conservation practices?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to point out that the folks, most of everybody started off on small number of acres. And I think, like, for example, when switching to no-till, there was probably a little bit of learning curve and some adjustments that were made in terms of planting equipment. We heard that comment made quite often, is when you're planting into, say, cover crops, into where the equipment that you have on your planter is pretty critical to have in terms of being at, down force pressure and things like that, so that you can plant into firm seed beds and manage the planting operation. The other thing is, I think farmers that were working with cover crops, example, talked a little bit about having to make some adjustments in terms of, like, for example, planting corn into a rye cover crop. For example, there were sometimes where a small amount of starter fertilizer placed close to the corn row was important to prevent any kind of a short-term nutrient stress to the corn crop. So those were some learnings that were acquired over time. And I think a lot of the folks there worked with a lot of the people in Iowa, for example, worked with Iowa State University and a lot of those organizations that are providing advice to farmers around how to get the most out of some of these soil health practices.
Uh-huh. Okay. Were there any farmers in any state, so across the 9 states, the 100 farms that were part of this analysis, that reported lower partial budgets due to soil health practice adoption, system adoption? And if so, why do you think that those profits were lower?
So I don't know if we'll go back to this one slide here. There was one farm, for example, in Iowa, where they saw a reduction in net farm income associated with adopting these soil health practices. It wasn't a significant amount, but it was nonetheless a smaller amount, and so a lesser amount. That's another thing we may have to, as we analyze or summarize more of these reports, might have to sort of look at why these practices. Sometimes farmers mention some of these farmers weren't as far into the system, maybe hadn't seen all the benefits yet associated with the practices.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one explanation.
Okay. And do you have any ballpark sense, John, across the 100 farms interviewed, how many reported lower revenue or net farm income?
Archie, I know you have that histogram of the 100 farms. Do you remember what that number was?
It was across all 100, 15 corn reports had decreased net farm income, and I think it was 12 soybean had decreased net farm income. But keep in mind that we didn't include potential NRCS incentive equipment payments for this, and we didn't collect that. We didn't try to get that because sometimes it's only a temporary for a few years. Sometimes states have different amounts. And then as John said, it could be that even though they've been practicing this for 5 years, there could be reduced costs that they haven't realized yet that they will realize in the future.
All right. So you mentioned that these growers were adopting soil health practices for 5 years. Was the reduction in yield happening after 5 years or in year 1 of adoption?
Reduction in yield or in cost?
Yield. This person is asking about yield.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. We wouldn't have that kind of information to see. They didn't report, or we didn't ask that question about did you see a reduction in yield. Our question was basically, what are you doing now versus what you were doing way back when you started, where you were still doing conventional practices. So we don't really have a good timeline of these changes over the course of the journey, if you will. I don't know if that.
And I think that for those that are interested in our specific process, there are other questions about the process for capturing these changes. I would direct everyone where we have that detailed to soilhealthinstitute.org/economics, where you can see that methodology.
I don't know, Archie, do you have?
Well, let's clarify the last question. The way I heard the question, it was asked about reduced yields. Of these 10 Iowa farms, nobody reported reduced yields to the soil health management systems. Now, if the question is how long did it take them to realize the increased yield, well, we don't have the information for that. It wouldn't be right away. Usually, it would be several years. But nobody had a decreased yield due to the soil health management system.
There were actually only 2 farmers of the 100 farmers that reported a reduced yield, and those farmers made up the difference in some of the other crops they were growing. And corn was a pretty insignificant part of their operation.
That's right. And then going back to the previous question, in some cases, when we did have a farmer that had a decrease in net farm income, for one crop, for example, corn, they more than made up for it by an increase in the other crop, such as soybean. So sometimes a decrease is balanced out and even more by an increase in another crop. We did the crops separately instead of the whole farm.
That's where these histograms are a little bit misleading, because they could have lost money in soybean, but made money in corn, and so that it offset the overall net farm income change.
Okay, and just moving to the next question related to these histograms, John, would you say that these capture, this attendee asked about the variability? What was the variability in the net change in income across these 10 farmers interviewed in Iowa? I think that these histograms show that variability.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, they capture this. I mean, these histograms look very similar across all states. We see a very similar distribution. It looks very similar across all 100 of the farmers that we talked to.
All right. I don't know if we're going to get to all the questions today, but we'll continue to try. This is a question about tillage. Was no-till considered for farmers who are 100% no-till, or for those who sometimes didn't till, like, for example, they may no-till in the fall,
right,
but have some tillage in the spring?
So we specifically asked the question: is these acres been in no-till, and or do you occasionally till? And if they answer the question, they do some occasional tillage, then it would go into the reduced till category. So if they told us they were no-till, then they weren't doing any other forms of tillage.
Okay. Another question: did you analyze any of the financial considerations for farmers that used cover crops versus farmers that didn't use cover crops?
Yeah, and Archie may want to back me up on this one, but no, we don't have a separate analysis. And again, I think part of the reason we have done this for individual states is we may be able to do this when we aggregate the 100 farms together, but just a smaller sample size, it seems we felt like it was going to be difficult to draw too many conclusions.
That's correct. When we do the analysis over the entire 100, we will separate out cover crops separately from just strictly no-till or reduced till. But with a small 10 in a state, it's really not meaningful to do that.
Could I actually ask just a real quick question on that, right? So on the broader study, so once you aggregate all this together, what kind of the intent on kind of how that will be shared and what will be available? So, we're starting with the individual state level information, but then once everything's done, all 100 farmers are in the full, what's that look like, or what's the plan? I think that might be helpful to understand.
Right, Ryan. So we actually been talking to your team a little bit about that. I think as soon as we can get all these individual reports finished out and reported, then our goal probably towards the end of May, that we would have an aggregated report of all, and hopefully that what the opportunity to draw some broad sweeping conclusions from these 100 farmers. And so that'll be developed into a fact sheet as well that'll be posted. And I don't know exactly for sure about the webinar, but that's something that we could likely include as well.
Great. Yeah, great question, Ryan. Did you have any follow-up to that?
No, I just thought it'd be helpful. I thought everybody that's still on may be interested to know kind of what the plan is, beyond the individual states, and just understanding that there will be a fuller kind of report later on.
Yeah, good point.
There'll be a full report that aggregates all 100 farms, assessed as part of this project. All right, did this project within Iowa and this economics project include any initial costs for specialized equipment used for no-till, for example, like no-till planters or, other equipment that might be used to adopt and implement these practices and systems?
Archie, I'll let you go ahead.
In the partial budget analysis, we did account for the difference between a no-till planter and a regular row crop planter. However, that difference is not very great. If you go to the University of Illinois Extension website, they have a list of all the equipment prices. For a typical 16-row planter, there's only about $10,000 difference between a no-till planter and what they list as a row crop planter, and that's the row cleaners open, the coulters that close in the back. So there's not that much difference, and some farmers told us that they were using the same planter in no-till as what they were in conventional till. But to the extent that any differences did exist, our methodology did account for that.
These are some other methodology questions. Were there any changes that farmers had to make in their accounting or financial tracking systems in order to track the economic aspects for this study? And then it goes on to ask, were farmers hesitant to give us their previous and current revenue numbers? If so, how did we get around that?
Okay. The methodology that we applied was field production. We didn't ask any questions related to any accounting or record keeping system that they may have. And the way we collected the data, we collected information for production processes, field activities and inputs, and we didn't have to go into their personal farm information for financial records. They would describe the production process to us, and we would apply standardized input prices for chemicals and fertilizers. And the methodology that we used to calculate equipment costs would have used average equipment prices. So the way we've done the analysis, the results are robust to all acreage. It's not just an individual farm analysis. We were analyzing production processes.
Great. Okay. Here's a question. How significant are these changes in net income in percentage terms based on average earnings per acre? I don't know.
We don't have the data to answer that. We could look at some secondary information and come up with an answer, but that wasn't really our goal and objective. Our goal and objective was to demonstrate the potential for increasing net farm income from adopting these practices.
Yeah. Great. And thank you, Sarah Carlson at Practical Farmers of Iowa. She said there are 88,000 farmers in Iowa. So just kind of building on that additional potential, these are 10 farms interviewed of a potential 88,000 that could take advantage of these soil health systems and practices. Are there some examples of cover crop species typically used by these farms assessed in Iowa that they made mention of?
So the common cover crop species we heard mentioned were, and we have to go back to the notes and get real specific, but I mean cereal rye, annual rye were oftentimes mentioned, and then other times there would be, if they were trying to introduce legumes for some nitrogen fixation, it would be in brassicas, things like radishes for breaking up tillage pans and things like that. But I'll probably omit some things if I don't go back to my notes. But there were legumes and brassicas included along with the rye.
Did we see any impact on or any impact due to rainfall variance, or precipitation, irrigation practices?
Well, in Iowa, if we start to summarize maybe some of these results again across the U.S., we'll be able to draw some conclusions. Some of the things we did hear, sort of anecdotally speaking, is when we talk to farmers in the I states, for example, where precipitation is considerably higher than it say is in South Dakota and Nebraska, one of the benefits that many of the growers talked about was being able to access the field a little quicker after, say, a significant rain event. The cover crops help to kind of remove some improved infiltration. The root mass kind of provided a little bit of ballast for trafficability and whatnot. So we heard it pretty regularly from farmers who were using cover crops and were experienced at it, that the cover crops help them deal with these really wet spring conditions, sort of absorbing some of the water so that they could get to the field a little bit quicker. So I don't know. The other comment around that is sometimes farmers would say that cover crops would help a lot in terms when it improved infiltration. They saw in some of the dry years that there was some more resilience to, say, a drought stress, for example, because they had captured more water into the profile. So I don't know if that gets at the question of that question or not, but those are some.
And I know there's additional.
Uh-huh.
I know there's additional information as well, John, and for the individual that asked this question, if you go to soilhealthinstitute.org/economics and download that fact sheet, there's very specific information around those kind of precipitation gradients across the state.
We had a table, and I didn't include it in there, that again, it's a survey of the farmers and what they felt were some of the benefits. And so things like the yield increase, the reductions in nutrient application, 97% of the farmers, recalling from recollection here, said that their farm operations were more resilient to extreme weather. So that's a pretty significant number of farmers who felt like these things like cover cropping and or no-till made their farm operation more resilient. So, hopefully down the road that has some impact on crop insurance rates and things like that. If the insurance industry starts to realize that there's more resiliency in the system, then likely there'll have to be less, and hopefully the rates can be reduced because of that.
All right, we have about 8 minutes left. Will there be a paper journal article published with additional details on this study?
Right now, we don't have that plans in the work, Byron. The next step after we get these 9 reports done is to generate that overall report for all 100 farmers. The project itself may lend itself to that. Archie's a little bit more familiar with the publishing in economic journals. So I don't know, Archie, do you feel like this would have some possibility there?
Yes, there's some potential for it as a case study type analysis. Over 100 farms, I think we have some good information that would be very interesting to publish.
Okay, great. And was any of the farms interviewed? Do we know, were any of them kind of implementing grazing in any way on those operations?
Right, that's a great question. There were I can't remember. I think there were 2 farms in Iowa that were doing some grazing, or sometimes they would harvest the cover crop for forage and feed it to their livestock. So yeah, that in some cases that adds a significant amount of revenue to the bottom line by using those cover crops for livestock feed. Was it 2, Archie?
I think there were 2 in this state. It will be mentioned in the fact sheet, but we didn't include it in these results reported today because it was only 1 or 2 at most in a state, but it is reported in the fact sheet.
Great. Yeah, and a lot of these questions I think will be gleaned as participants see that fact sheet. We have answered, we have more questions to answer than we have answered to date. So I think that it's good news, and thank you all for your interest. If we do not get to your question in the next 5 minutes, we will be following up as best we can to answer those individual questions. Let's see. Did we break out farmers using cover crops and those that didn't? Or were the numbers too small? I think we may have already addressed that, John.
Yeah, so the way the benefits were determined, it was kind of an aggregate. I mean, we reported what percent of the acres where each farmer adopts no-till or cover cropping, but the benefit itself was sort of aggregated together between using both no-till and cover cropping.
Mm-hmm. Great. Somebody had a comment, and just to clarify, I think I can answer this one. They say that you mentioned NRCS cost share payments were not included, but what about ecosystem market payments that could be long-term payment opportunities? I think that, yeah, John, please.
Yeah, so I mean, again, that wasn't included in our study. I mean, I think it's a very valid question, and I think there's a lot of farmers that are very interested. You know, some of the farmers we talked to mentioned this, that you're talking. I think we're talking about carbon credits and water quality credits, and I mean, if this marketplace works out, I think it's one way to help farmers maybe obtain a little bit more revenue, especially as they're starting out in this journey of adopting these practices. It could help them offset some of those maybe initial upfront costs, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And further increase net revenue.
Yeah.
Man, there's some very detailed questions. Of these 10 farms in Iowa listed in the blue income bar graphs, can you tell which used cover crops here?
No, not. I mean, if we dug back into it, we could probably find that information, but not in these bars here. No.
And around cover crops as well, we said 58% cover crop usage among the farmers that we'd interviewed. Is that cover crops every year, or just before one of the crops, or a combination? So I guess, what is that planting cover crop schedule like, is perhaps what they're getting at?
I mean, if they started working with cover, I mean, some farmers work more specifically with one crop than the other. And again, that's not reported in here. We collect that information on which crop. So that's how that's how we calculate the partial budget. Is we ask the question for each crop, what cover crops are you using? So we have that individual information, but it's not reported here or summarized.
Okay. Here's one we haven't looked at yet. Were there any, this looks to compare cost yield benefits or profitability benefits, any soil health, organic matter, nematode population, fungus, et cetera, comparisons over time? Did we look at soil aggregate size, soil organic carbon, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, those we didn't. Well, there are some anecdotal comments made again. We asked the question, did you see an increase in soil organic matter? And I think many people, it was a sort of an anecdotal observation. They saw the soils darken up, but about 67%, a little over half of them said that they measured, they kept good track of their soil test results and measured an increase in soil organic carbon or soil organic matter. I think the average number was a little over 1% increase for all 100 farmers. So yes, they did see an increase. So several of them were very cognizant that they were likely going to see an increase, and they were very attentive to measuring it. And over a half of them said, on average, about a 1.2, 1.3 increase in soil organic matter. In terms of nematodes and pathogens and pests, I actually have a photograph, an image from one of our growers in Illinois, where they were planting cover crops ahead of soybean and saw a much reduced increase in white mold incidence. In fact, I think he had some strip trials in that field where he had cover crops and no cover crops. And I think he measured with the yield monitor a 20 bushel yield decline where there were no cover crops planted. And it was he attributed to the suppression in white mold incidence. So those cases. There was another farm. Yeah, there were several farmers that talked about maybe using going with naked seed treatments because there wasn't quite as much pest pressure. So we heard several comments along those lines.
Great. All right. Well, we are at time. We have many questions, about 35 that we had not had the opportunity to get to. So we will record these and hope to respond to you by email. A lot of them can be answered by going to soilhealthinstitute.org/economics and downloading that fact sheet. Thank you again, Dr. John Shanahan. Thank you, Dr. Flanders. And thank you, Mr. Ryan Ciroli at Cargill for your support, and for all of you today who've joined our webinar. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will be conducting another webinar next week on March 25th for those 12 farms that were part of this study in Nebraska. Great afternoon.
See y'all.
Thank you.